Thanks so much for having me here. Feel free to interrupt with questions and throughout. I think lively discussions tend to be more fun. But I do reserve the right to punt questions at the end if I think it'll kind of divert us too much. So in my lab, I think a lot about the dynamics of thought. And one of the ways I like to introduce kind of the key model, the key style of models that my lab uses. Should I stand further away? That's just my voice. It has a kind of metallic.
Let's try.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great. I like to. What I'm drawing here is a timeline of the thoughts that you might have had from the time you woke up this morning until now. So we're going to go through kind of 4 events. Waking up, maybe going to the gym and working out, eating some food, and then listening to me talk. So some of the thoughts that you have from moment to moment are going to reflect your immediate sensory experience of kind of being in each moment. So when you're looking at, you open your eyes and you're hearing your alarm clock go, you're hearing the sounds and seeing the sights. When you turn off your alarm clock, you're kind of, the parts of your brain that are representing your kind of immediate auditory experiences stop reflecting the kind of sounds of the alarm clock. And when you move through the world, your immediate view is going to change. When you eat a meal, you're kind of tasting the food, you're hearing sounds around you, you're seeing the sights. When you stop experiencing eating, your immediate sensory experience moves on. So the sorts of thoughts that are related to our immediate sensory experiences tend to change relatively quickly as what our brain's sensors are measuring changes. But those aren't the only sorts of thoughts you have. Riding on top of these kind of fast-moving thoughts are more persistent thoughts. So maybe before you have your first cup of coffee in the morning, you're kind of thinking of getting coffee. And then exactly after you eat lunch, you transition from wanting to be more awake to wanting to be more asleep. And then you're kind of ready for your nap. So instead of listening to me talk, you're thinking about wanting to nap. And because these sorts of thoughts aren't driven by your immediate sensory experiences, they often persist for longer. And then you can have really long timescale thoughts, like your sense of being in this geographic area, like being in the Bay Area, and those sorts of thoughts could persist for days or weeks or even years. The models that my lab thinks most about make a very simple assumption, which is that thoughts that are coactive are going to be associated with each other. And that means that, just that kind of simple idea has really profound implications for how we process the world and also how we remember our past. So for example, if I ask you what you had for lunch today, you're going to kind of bring back in your mind the thoughts that you had related to kind of eating lunch. But then because at the time you ate lunch, some of these slower kind of persistent thoughts might also have been hanging around, they're going to be associated with your memory of lunch. And because those persistent thoughts are going to tend to have started before you started eating lunch, and they're going to last till after you finish lunch, those persistent thoughts are going to also tend to be associated with other things that you experience nearby in time. So your memory of lunch is going to remind you kind of other things you experience nearby in time. One of my favorite pieces of neural evidence that this is actually how our brains kind of process and respond to the world comes from a relatively recent study by Uri Hassan's group, led by Chris Baldessano. And they looked at a data set collected, so an fMRI data set collected as people watched a 45-minute movie. And this is a searchlight analysis, so they're looking at how each piece of brain is responding to the movie. And for each piece of brain, they made what are called temporal correlation matrices. So you can take kind of one brain bit, draw a sphere around it, and then inside that sphere you get a pattern of voxel activities. And then at each time point you get a different activity pattern, and you can ask how correlated is that activity pattern at each pair of time points throughout watching the movie. And one of the kind of surprising things to come out of that work, you can see in these two examples pretty clearly, those temporal correlation matrices have this kind of blocky, checkerboardy structure. What that means is that your activity patterns, at least in these two brain bits, tend to persist for some amount of time, and then they rapidly shift, then they persist, and then they jump. So that's not really how we learn that neural activity patterns change, like in our intro neuroscience classes. But most pieces of our brain exhibit this kind of blocky activity pattern structure. So that's one kind of interesting thing. And then the second interesting thing is that if you look at different brain regions, the blockiness changes in its temporal scale. So if you look at kind of primary sensory regions, you tend to get small checkerboardy patterns, which means that the kind of states of neural activity tend to persist for relatively short durations, and they change rapidly. And then if you look at higher order regions, they tend to have a similar checkerboardy pattern, but the checkerboard squares are bigger, which means that those kind of activity states persist for longer. And then there's this beautiful map. There are various ways to make this map, but you can color each brain region according to kind of how frequent the transitions are, and get a beautiful rainbow out of that. So if different pieces of brain are sensitive to structure at different time scales, that has pretty important implications for how we think about brain activity patterns and how we think about the dynamics of thought. For example, it's not really sufficient, if this is how we really think the brain works, it's not really sufficient to consider one moment of our experience in isolation of everything else we've experienced. Because the way our kind of brain responds overall is going to reflect structure at a whole range of time scales. So that also has implications for how we study the brain. So the kind of classic approach that many psychology labs use, including mine, even still, although not exclusively, is to create these kind of trial-based experiments. So who's ever run a trial-based experiment? Yeah, there you go. Well, they're useful for many things. But if we think that our brains are representing kind of long timescale patterns, and those long timescale patterns affect how we think about each new moment, then the kind of classic way, the classic way of analyzing trial-based data is kind of flawed. So the way we typically think about trial-based data is you say, like, you show someone a picture, and you assume that when the picture's on the screen, all you're thinking about is that picture. Then the screen blanks, and now you're thinking about nothing. And then the next trial comes on, and now you're thinking solely about the next image that you're showing someone. But if we have like pieces of our brain that are representing structure that persists for like years, then that's going to miss out on something big. Also, if the kind of rich structure at many time scales is important for how we experience the world and how our brains work, then these kind of sorts of experiments are just not going to capture that structure. So we can't really study that structure well using this sort of experiment. So my lab has moved towards using kind of more so-called naturalistic experiments, which, things like having people listening to stories or watch movies. And although naturalistic experiments, and there's some controversy about whether they actually reflect what we do in the real world, I don't think a movie is quite like real life. But they're nice in that these sorts of stimuli contain meaningful structure at a wide range of timescales. And so if we're interested in thought patterns that reflect structure at many timescales, these sorts of stimuli can at least help us look at those patterns. So these diagrams are like, they show character interactions for two popular movies, Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars trilogy, popular trilogy, I guess. And it's not really critical that you understand what's going on here, but you can see this kind of complicated time scale of interactions between characters reflecting kind of interesting potential structure at changing over time. So one kind of key point is these sorts of stimuli that are complicated and kind of show interesting structure at a range of timescales are going to be important for allowing us to study how the brain represents kind of life at many timescales. Another point is that if different pieces of brain represent information at different timescales, then the kind of sum picture of what our brains are thinking about is going to be fundamentally a network property. So this is my one network dynamics slide, which I feel kind of sad about because I really spent the past decade thinking hard about network dynamic models, but couldn't fit everything in the top. But half of my lab's work is on kind of building models of network dynamics. And I think this is a critical piece to kind of understanding how we process the world, because network dynamics are going to help us understand how different representations that persist for different lengths of time are interacting in the brain. Another powerful tool for looking at how thoughts change over time leverages this idea that my lab calls thought spaces. So this is an example kind of 3D projection of a thought space. The idea of a thought space is that every point in this space is going to represent a thought or kind of set of thoughts that you can have. And then the geometry of these spaces are set up so that thoughts or concepts that are similar in meaning are going to live close by, like duck and goose. And then thoughts that are dissimilar in meaning, like duck and truck, are going to live far apart. And then, over time in an experiment, we can try to build a decoding model that tries to use your brain activity or behavioral patterns to estimate what you're thinking at each moment, which corresponds to like one point or one cloud in this space. And then from moment to moment, we can connect the dots of what you're thinking about and trace out some interesting looking trajectory describing how your thoughts changed over time in response to some task you were doing or some stimulus that you were watching. And representing and thinking about thoughts in this way allows us to kind of turn the problem of testing cognitive theories into a geometry problem. So the way that you characterize thoughts is as kind of the shapes of these trajectories. And then you can start to look at kind of geometric properties of these trajectories to test cognitive theories. For example, when the trajectory kind of loops back on itself, looping back is like revisiting old thoughts. And so kind of memory patterns tend to look like loops in these trajectories. And then you can like compare different people's, yes?
How do you build this thought space? How do you know how many dimensions, for example?
Yeah, so the dimensionality of thought is a super interesting, like solving the truth of that question is a super interesting and challenging problem, and we don't have the answer about like how many dimensions thought has. The way my lab typically builds these spaces is in one of two ways. The most common way is we train word embedding models on big collections of documents. So thought space is really like word embedding space. If you've heard of like Word2Vec or GPT-2 or topic models, it represents the meanings of words or concepts as feature vectors. So the dimensions are the dimensions of those that those models find. The second way that we use to build these thought spaces are based on brain patterns. So if thinking about two concepts gives rise to similar brain patterns on average, we put them close by in this space. So the dimensions are like neural activity patterns in that approach. And then you can build hybrid versions that kind of use one as the prior and try to build like a semantic map that's influenced by your brain activity patterns, etc. Here are some real thought trajectories decoded from people's brain activity patterns as they're listening to a story. So each colored line here is some person's thoughts as they're listening to decoded thoughts as they're listening to the story. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So first of all, you can see that like there are some like key points in the story where everyone's thought trajectories deflect. And then you can ask like, why is that happening? Is that like a particularly engaging part of the story perhaps? Or some like event boundary? And then even though people's thought trajectories look kind of similar over time, which is a nice sanity check because it means that we're capturing maybe some kind of common thoughts that people are having in response to the same story, people's trajectories don't look identical. And so we can use differences in decoded thought trajectories to test theories. Like, for example, if you look moment by moment in a story, you can look at kind of the spread of thoughts that people have and ask, are there properties of the story or the people that kind of controls how spread out people's thoughts are? Or you can take like one particular person's thoughts and ask when and how much they kind of differ from the average. And then you can ask like, is the process that determines that perhaps related to like some interaction between the properties of the person and the properties of the story or someone's past experiences, etc. So it really turns kind of looking at thoughts into this kind of geometry problem. Another example of how we use this approach is actually using the same kind of open data set that the timescale map study used. So in this experiment, the checkerboardy patterns came from people's brain activity recorded as people were watching a movie. But there was another part to that data set which had, so people watched, what was really happening in that experiment is people watched a episode of the BBC television show Sherlock, and then they verbally recounted what happened in that episode, all being scanned. And other kind of important features of that data set are that the lab that collected this data set, so that study was led by Janice Chen, also in Uri Hassan's lab at the time. And they had RAs, like a whole group of RAs, painstakingly annotate each kind of 2 seconds of this movie. And the idea was to kind of objectively describe what was happening in each 2 seconds. So every time there was like a camera scene cut. And you can apply these kind of thought space models or word embedding models to those annotations to get out a trajectory that describes the content of the movie as it evolves, as it kind of changes over time. Once you have that model trained, so this shape tells you what the movie was about and how the contents of the movie change from moment to moment. And then you can ask, when people recount what happened in the movie, again, that's like a sequence of text, you can ask what path their recountings take through the same thought space. And that allows you to test people's memory as this kind of shape comparison problem. So this figure on the left is like the real data, like projected into thought space as people are recounting the movie. And one thing you can see kind of by eye is that these shapes look similar, which means that people are, in general, recalling the video, you know, what happened in the video pretty well. And these arrows, kind of this vector field thing, those represent kind of the outcomes of a statistical test asking for, across people, if people's thought trajectories as they're recalling the video pass through that part of thought space, what was the average angle of the kind of direction of movement from that part of thought space out until wherever their trajectory moved next. And the blue arrows the longer and bluer the arrows are, the more consistent the trajectories were across people. So you can see it's kind of like looking at a kind of river current kind of flowing throughout the course of this trajectory. And you can see that like people recall the movie similarly pretty much throughout the whole movie. It's kind of interesting. Since we know, so yes.
What are the dark arrows as opposed to the blue arrows?
Yes. So the black, the black arrows?
Oh no, I was thinking about the black ones that are like field lines down the bottom, below the.
Right here? That's actually dark blue.
Oh.
Yeah, so all the arrows that are not attached to these black lines are kind of those hypothesis tests.
And the stronger they are, the darker.
The more consistent, that's right. Yeah, so the bluer and the longer. Another like interesting thing here that's kind of a subtlety if you haven't thought about how people recall real-world events is the classic way of studying memory that's been used for many, many years is something like you take a random word list and like, apple, banana, cat, dog, etc. And you show someone that list. I mean, that wasn't a random list, but in reality it would be random. And then you have someone verbally recount or type out what words people remember. And when you do that sort of experiment, like the way you analyze the data is something like you can ask which words does someone remember and in what order. And you can do manipulations like ask people to try to remember things in order, in the order that they occurred, or the reversed order that they occurred, or the order words come to mind. But there's an kind of underappreciated matching problem that those sorts of experiments assume. So if you recall the word apple, and apple was a word on the list, from an analysis perspective, we know that your recounting of the word apple corresponds to the study of the same word on the list. Okay? So there's no like extra assumption that goes into that problem. But think about what would happen if you experienced the same thing as someone else, and now I ask, tell me what happened. The words that you use to describe that experience might not overlap with your friend's words who experienced the same thing, but the meaning underlying the experience might have been common. So if you both accurately recounted something, the content, the meaning underlying what you're saying might be similar, but the words might not even overlap at all. So what this sort of approach gives us is a way of kind of getting around that problem. We're capturing the meanings of experiences as they're unfolding in time. Even though everyone is using a unique blend of words to describe each moment, we're capturing some commonality. So we've kind of solved this matching problem, which is a really kind of theoretically difficult problem to solve. And the way we're doing it is using these kind of geometric thought spaces. Yes?
If it doesn't disrupt you too much, what was your ground truth of the previous one?
Of this one?
Yeah.
Well, so in this experiment, there is no ground truth here. I mean, we have the text of the story, but we don't know what thoughts people have. So, like,
so these are inferred trajectories.
So this plot here is, so we use. All right, I'll do a summary of the method. Yeah, so we use half the story to train the kind of semantic decoding model. Then using the other half of the story, we decode the coordinates in thought space, which is like word embedding space, using brain activity patterns. And what we're plotting here are those decoded thoughts from the held out data.
And how do you take out the stimulus material from that?
Well, we only use the brain patterns from the second half of the story to make these
So the stimuli
plots.
would be different to that point?
Yeah, we could then, I guess the ground truth would be, we know what the story was about at each moment, so we could compare the trajectory shapes from the decoded patterns in the original story. We don't actually do that here. It doesn't really matter for this particular study what thoughts people have in response to the story.
Right.
Here, this is just a demonstration of people's thoughts change in similar ways in response to the same input. We're not, it could be interesting to then decode what those thoughts were.
It could
and
also
explore
just
further.
be your internal kind of voice for the story. It might not be
That's right.
tends
That's
to be
right.
by thought,
Yeah, I think it varies
Okay.
by story, likely. So like something sad happens, you're thinking, oh, there are other sad things that happened to me. Here's how this story relates to my own experience. Those could be kind of idiosyncratic thoughts across people. And for this analysis, that's okay with us if you're not solely thinking what's happening in the story.
But you could just be solely thinking about the story.
That's right,
nothing
you could be,
else.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so we did look at that sort of thing in this paper. So here, what you can do is, for each kind of event in the movie, you can, one way of visualizing it is as kind of a word cloud. So each coordinate in thought space corresponds to some kind of blend of thoughts that you're having. And then you can plot out kind of the weighted blend of words that that coordinate in thought space reflects. So you get these kind of wordle figures. And then you can say, when people were talking about that part of the movie, you get a new coordinate in thought space, and that corresponds to a new wordle. And then you can drill into the kind of blend of thoughts that were present in the original actual event that people saw, and then the overlapping but potentially slightly different pattern of events or kind of thoughts that people had when they described that part of the video. And exploring kind of where these match well versus poorly, or what thoughts that you inject into a past experience is, like, gives us interesting insights into what our memory systems are doing. Another way of kind of thinking about this is using a measure that we call precision, which is really just correlation. So if you take an event's word embedding vector, or like coordinate in thought space, that's a feature vector. And if you take someone's recall of that event, that's another feature vector. And you can use the correlation between those feature vectors as a measure of how precisely the way you describe that event in the movie reflects what kind of annotators said were happening in that movie. And so here, what's happening on top is I've taken each kind of event in the movie, and for every person who recalled that event, we can plot the correlation between the original video event's feature vector and the feature vector corresponding to how they described that event. And so for each event, you get kind of a distribution of correlation values describing the range of kind of fidelities with which people recalled that event. And then you can start to kind of drill into this and say, for a particular event, what are the kind of details that comprise that event? And so you don't have to read this text if you don't want, it's kind of small, but you can see there's like a rainbow of hideous looking colors. Each color corresponds to a detail. And then you can take someone who recalled that movie precisely, or that event precisely according to this model, and ask, what's the rainbow of colors, like using the same color scheme that's present in someone's recall? And you can see lots of colors when people recall things precisely. And then when someone doesn't recall the event precisely, what's the kind of blend of colors that you see? And you can see there are kind of fewer colors overall. So even though from a kind of classic memory viewpoint, both of these people successfully recalled what happened and accurately recalled what happened, this kind of word embedding approach gives us a way of kind of getting at some nuance to what's the quality or depth of recall that people are producing. Another interesting set of insights has to do with when we remember a past event, how do we kind of spread our thoughts over our autobiographical timeline, going from now back to kind of the beginning of our thoughts. So this is kind of a timeline going backwards from now. And then let's say we're remembering something that occurred in our past, indicated by this red dot. So part of our mind is processing what's happening to us now, and part of our mind is like kind of bringing back thoughts related to what we experienced at the time we experienced the original event. And one interesting question is like, what's the mix of thoughts that, like what's the balance between our thoughts related to processing now and what's the versus the thoughts related to what we experienced in the past. That's interesting to think about. But then we can start to kind of add some nuance to this figure. So we know that some of our thoughts persist for long time scales. And so there's going to be some kind of temporal blurriness to how we spread our thoughts over our past. Also, during other parts of our lives, maybe we experienced related things that were related to the event we're remembering. And so maybe some part of our kind of brains are reactivating thoughts related to those experiences. It would be useful to be able to integrate across related experiences. And then kind of in general, you can ask for each moment along your autobiographical timeline, going backwards in time, what is the kind of degree to which you are currently reactivating your thoughts related to that moment, or that you had in that moment, at the time that you're recalling this particular past event. It's kind of different from the classic kind of mental time travel view of episodic memory, where kind of the Endel-Tulving version of episodic memory is like you mentally time travel back to the time when you experienced the original event, and your brain looks like it did when you were experiencing the original event. This view says the way you think about the past is you spread your thoughts over a range of time points, and you're really experiencing kind of a weighted blend of thoughts about different moments from your past. We can use the kind of thought space approach to actually plot those kind of weighting functions. So what I'm showing here is for one moment of the Sherlock episode, if you just look at the word embedding feature vectors related to how annotators were kind of describing objectively what's happening at each moment, you can ask what's the correlation between the feature vectors at the time of this moment in the video and then all other moments in the video. It's like the way, kind of the particular blend of content that's happening right then. What you see is that, and this is true of most parts of the video, it was actually kind of surprising. Basically what you find is that the unique blend of things that's happening at any point in this episode is basically unique, modulo like a tiny bit of spread forwards and backwards in time. And that means that, so the reason that's surprising is that if you've seen the Sherlock show, it's kind of this recurring, this particular episode, there's kind of this recurring murder motif that repeats. And then there are even like things like flashbacks to prior parts of the same episode. So literally, like, you have video overlaid on other video that's replaying other things that you've already seen. But the unique blend of things that are happening, the blend of things that are happening overall is unique for each moment, even though specific dimensions of what's happening or specific elements of what are happening might be repeated. Does that make sense? Then you can ask, when you have someone recall this, or when people remember this part of the movie, how do they describe it? And how does that compare to how people describe other parts of the movie? What you get out is this, well, so the colored lines are kind of individual people, and then the black line is the average across people. And what you find is that when people recall a specific moment from the video, they describe it in a way that's similar to how they described other parts of the episode, even that were distant in time. And the peaks and dips that happen in this kind of weird-looking function actually correspond to meaningfully related events. So in this particular part of the video, what was happening is that Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, who are the two main characters, were kind of bantering with each other in a humorous way, and then they were interrupted when a new murder happens. And the peaks occur at other points when Sherlock and Watson are kind of bantering with each other or kind of jokingly talking about each other, or other similar murders. But these peaks don't happen when Sherlock and Watson are appearing in isolation or during kind of other violent parts of the episode. So even though the specific blend of things that is happening at that moment is unique, the way people describe what's happening here ties in information about other related parts of the episode when they're recalling that moment later. So this framework gives us a way of capturing the dynamics of thought and the dynamics of how we retrieve prior kind of events. And then it gives us a geometric framework for comparing different people's thoughts or different thoughts related to different experiences. And it allows us to test theories using this kind of geometric framework, which gives us new insights. This is all really useful. And it's kind of, well, in a vein that's a kind of approach that's taken by most of psychology and neuroscience, which is to kind of collect some data and then build a model that describes the data kind of after the fact. And so that's great, that's useful. But what I've started to really kind of come to appreciate is that we can never know if our models are right, but that's a particularly kind of unsatisfying way of kind of testing our theories. So what we've started to move towards in my lab is trying to use causal manipulation. So we build a model that describes how we remember stuff, and then we use that model to manipulate what we show people. And if our models are right, that should predict meaningful things that happen to people. And the domain that we're focusing on initially has to do with optimizing the rate at which people learn. So here's how learning is depicted in like kind of science fiction movies, like kind of optimized learning. It's super easy. Bonus points if you can tell me what you did. Ooh, hard to see.
I know kung fu. Flatline?
Sure.
It's not sure. Yeah, matrices, yeah. Yeah, so you just, like to learn something new, you just, in sci-fi land, you just like download the stuff to your brain, like right into a hard drive, and suddenly you know it. It's super easy. Why not just learn everything? But then real life looks more like this typically.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? Great Depression, passed anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act.
Yes, you have like a super dynamic professor kind of spouting wisdom at the students. No, learning can be hard and boring. And our education model hasn't actually changed much since it started. We're still pretty much following like what the ancient Greeks did. And this is actually, in my view, a societal problem. One reason is that the kind of pool of human knowledge is expanding exponentially. So back in the day, getting a PhD in chemistry, for example, meant that you knew all of chemistry. And then you discovered something new, and suddenly the pool of human knowledge grew a little bit. Today, getting a PhD in chemistry often means learning about one molecule. And it's not that we are dumber now, it's that the amount of knowledge you need to cram into your brain to learn kind of all that there is to know about that molecule is kind of equivalent to what the entire field used to be. And that's happening across nearly every domain of inquiry. And part of the reason is that new discoveries can build on old discoveries, so the pace of knowledge kind of increase is accelerated. So it means that there are real consequences to reasoning about new discoveries, because if kind of the human brain capacity for learning is relatively constant, and the pool of human knowledge is growing exponentially, then our kind of ability to tap into all of human knowledge is just getting smaller and smaller over time. So the ability to integrate across fields is going to get worse and worse until we can't really reason about anything individually. But imagine a different world where you could learn a totally new language in a few hours, or memorize textbooks worth of information, or learn a whole undergraduate degree, or get your doctorate in a few hours. It would totally change the landscape of thoughts that you could have. And why can't we? Our brains are pretty good. Gazillions of years of evolution and whatnot. So maybe there are fundamental limits on how much information we can suck down from the world around us. So for example, maybe there's a limitation on the bit rate that our brain sensors can measure the world. And that's of course true. So we don't have infinitely many neurons, and our neurons aren't infinitely fast. So there is a physical bit rate, with which we can measure the world. But that's pretty high. Maybe our bit rate of kind of measurement is not the kind of bottleneck, but maybe we can only attend to a subset of what our brains perceive. And that's also certainly true. You can't attend to everything. But I don't think that's the bottleneck either. Or maybe we can only encode a subset of what we intend, or retrieve a subset of what we can code, or effectively communicate a subset of what we retrieve. So these are all real physical limitations on how fast we can learn. But I think we're actually nowhere near reaching the limits, these sorts of thresholds. So someday, humanity will have to confront these limitations, but we are not there yet. Instead, I think kind of learning inefficiencies come from not getting the right information at the right time. And so what we're doing in my lab is building model-based approaches to optimizing which information you're presented with when, in order to improve how fast you learn. So there are a few kind of key goals of this approach. So first, we wanted something that can generalize to any content that you might want to learn about, any academic content. We also didn't want to create all of human knowledge from scratch, so we wanted to use existing content. So we're using online course videos from Khan Academy. Also, we want learning to be fun, otherwise people won't use or care about this tool. And so to do that, we want to minimize the amount of effort that it takes for you to learn new stuff. The way it works at a high level is we're going to keep track of what you want to learn in these kind of thought spaces. And there's a tricky modeling problem that I'm happy to chat about in the Q&A, but related to knowledge dependencies. So you can't learn about arbitrary new content equally easily for all possible content. Some learning requires that you do other learning first. And that's tricky to model, and I'm happy to talk about how we're approaching that. And then we can make maps using these knowledge spaces or thought spaces of what you already know and how easily you could learn kind of any arbitrary new content. And then at each moment, given your learning goal, what you already know, and how easily you can learn, we can present the ideal part of kind of any online video available that will get you closest or get you the most distance towards your learning goal. And then we can say, for each moment of video watched, how rapidly do you approach kind of the knowledge that you're seeking? And so that's really our performance metric, not how well is our model kind of explaining the data. We hope it's explaining it well, but rather in real life, how fast are people actually able to learn? So it's like a much stronger theory test. Okay. So these are kind of early days for this project. One kind of key piece is we need to accurately have a model that incorporates to a reasonable degree the kind of range of things that online courses teach, and there's a huge diversity out there. What this figure is showing is for each video on Khan Academy, of which there are tens of thousands, or tens of thousands of courses, there are hundreds of thousands of videos. We can say for each course, if you average across time and across all the videos within a course, where do these courses live in these thought spaces? And then just as a sanity check, you can color different courses according to the human annotated labels of those courses. And you can see that kind of courses that are about similar things grouped together. That kind of tells us our thought space models are capturing something about new things. And then for an individual video, you can ask how the content of that video changes over time from moment to moment. That traces out some trajectory in thought space. And then you can ask people quiz questions about the content of that video. And each quiz question is itself kind of a block of text which you can plot in these word embedding spaces. And here what I've done is for one person, plotted 5 different questions, and then I've colored the questions green if they got the question right, and red if they got the question wrong. And now for each point along this trajectory, I can compute the weighted average of quiz questions you got right, where the weights are determined by how much each question is about that part of the video. And then I can kind of round the trajectory towards 0 if you answer fewer questions right, and round the trajectory towards the black line if you answer more questions right. This is kind of like attractants and repellents. And what you get out is a moment-by-moment estimate of how well you learned every single tiny moment of that video. You can do this for every point in thought space as well to create very detailed maps. So here's a cartoon. We can take your learning goal, which for the experiments we're running are kind of the coordinates that are in thought space that are within some threshold distance of the video's trajectory that we want you to learn about. So this black line represents a cartoon of the video. And I've colored dots in this cartoon green if they're within some threshold distance of that video. So these are like the concepts that we want you to learn about. And then red dots, we don't care if you know or don't know. And then for every coordinate in thought space, I can ask about the weighted proportion of quiz questions you can answer correctly, or our model predicts you'll answer correctly about content in that part of thought space. And then you get a green dot if we think you know that content sufficiently well, and a red dot if you don't. I can also ask about your predicted ease of learning different kind of arbitrary conceptual information, which you can model by looking at the change in your knowledge over time. And then we can kind of carve up every hundreds of thousands of videos at their kind of event joints, and then say for every event from every video that I could show you, given your learning goal, how much you already know, which you don't have to relearn, and how easily you can learn about any arbitrary content, I can show you the snippet of a given video that we think will get you closest towards your learning goal. And then I can repeat this over and over, periodically asking you quiz questions until you either achieve your learning goal or until the time runs out. So we're currently running experiments like with this framework, and you have lots of ideas about how you carve up videos and which features you use to kind of make these maps, etc. We're also thinking about how we can kind of bring the greatest benefit to humanity using this approach. And so to scale this up to real classrooms, we basically need a cheap solution that works pretty well. And so we're working with this company called OpenBCI, which makes 3D printed EEG headsets that are around $300. And then these super cheap and not totally crappy Raspberry Pi computers. They're about like 10 to 30 bucks, depending on which one you get. And then a cheap touchscreen. So this is our kind of learning kit. And the idea is you like snap on one of these headsets, interact with our kind of training program through the touchscreen, and the idea is that our hope is that it's going to kind of teach you as quickly as you could possibly learn. And so that full kind of framework currently costs around $500, and we'd love to get that cheaper, but that's exciting for us. So this general kind of approach of optimizing learning fits in with a much broader program of research that my lab is interested in, related to how you transmit information to other people, say through conversation. And the way we're thinking about transmission of information is essentially as the geometric alignment of different people's thought spaces in the part of thought space that you're communicating about. So the same models that we use to train how well, to like estimate how well a student learns from a teacher could be used to predict all kinds of interesting kind of interpersonal dynamics. Like if you have an expert who has kind of a very detailed thought space in some area, talking to a non-expert who has kind of a coarser ability to think distinct thoughts about something, can that expert, is the expert kind of more equipped to communicate with a non-expert because maybe their thought space is more flexibly able to conform to someone else's thought space? Close friends tend to share experiences, so perhaps the kind of control points of their thought spaces might align better than two strangers. So maybe close friends are able to communicate more efficiently than others, and this modeling framework would help predict that. Or doctors and patients. Doctors have, like what makes a doctor who can effectively communicate to their patients effective at communicating? Is it something about kind of empathy of the patient's thought space or ability to kind of flexibly change or reconfigure your thought space to match the patient? Teachers and leaders. Is that about influencing other people's thought spaces to conform to yours, or your kind of deformations of thought space that are kind of effectively conforming to others? Or can students especially effectively kind of be influenced by teachers' thought spaces if they're kind of good learners? Or if people have different experiences than us, how can we allow them to communicate more efficiently and effectively? And then kind of a sci-fi application of this work is to really think about what's the kind of limitation on how efficiently and reliably and quickly we can communicate information to other people's brains. So that's kind of an interesting theory question. And then also, can communication be augmented, like through neural prosthetics and whatnot? So my program of work takes insights from brain data and behaviors and cognitive theory, and we're kind of using those data sources to track the dynamics of thoughts, memories, and conversations. We model these things using geometric spaces, and that lets us take ideas from kind of classic memory work and classic cognitive theory and apply them, we think, effectively to more naturalistic, kind of real-world sorts of situations and experiences. And then we use the ability of our models to explain real-world things to test the effectiveness of our models. So, I also want to thank my lab for doing this work and my funding agencies for allowing me to do this work. And thanks very much for listening. Yeah.
I was curious, I'm not sure if you mentioned the role of the EEG cat.
Yes. Yeah. So we're using, so there are kind of three neural signals that we're thinking about. One is inspired by Uri Hassan's group. So how similar does, if you've heard of intersubject functional connectivity, it's like how similar does your brain look as you're learning about some content to the average of how other people's brains looked as they're learning about the same content. So it's kind of a crude measure of how much your brain activity dynamics are driven by the stimulus. So it's an imperfect measure of how much you're learning, but it gives us something. Another approach we use is kind of similar to a subsequent memory effect analysis, where you're saying, how does your brain look when you're learning about content that you later remember versus don't? So you get kind of a classifier output at each moment. And then the third type of model we use is an explicit semantic decoding model, where you use some data to train where in thought space you are most likely to be given your brain activity patterns. And then we have a coordinate for each moment of the video, and you can say, what's the correlation between your decoded thoughts and the content of the video at each moment? So the correlation time series tells you about how much you're thinking about each moment of the video. So all of these are kind of very noisy, imperfect measures, but we try to combine them and say, like, what weighted blend of these predictions helps us get people to learn faster and better. And you can do this with EEG, which we think is the way forward for kind of scaling this to the classroom, but also we're using like fMRI and ECOG and commercial grade EEG systems that give us higher signal to noise.
Do you think the EEG could potentially give you, like, would be better for optimizing what your goal was than just like behavior alone, or is it kind of like?
Well, that's the question. So
Yeah.
so the kind of tests here are like, if we add in brain data, how much does that help us versus using kind of behavioral data alone? There are other interesting questions like, if I optimize the model based on your data, does that help me to learn faster, or like the average person, does that help anyone to learn faster, or do I really have to make custom models for each person? And then you can say, like, maybe I can train a model on other people who are like you along some dimension. Is that better than just training a model specifically for you, or can you somehow, like, just cleaning up the signal, do a better job? So there are a gazillion of these sorts of kind of things to test. Yeah.
Yeah, in your weighted model of episodic memory, how do you distinguish, the fact that you might be influenced by other events, that happen to you, versus your memory not being very reliable, and you're thinking about it in more general terms, which...
Yeah. Meaning the, like, kind of distribution
right.
figure? Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, yeah. So, let me go back to that. Okay. So, the key is that describing a particular, well, there are kind of two things here. One is, can you describe a particular moment in a way that's unique? So if the same thing happens several times in the episode, I mean, what we thought would happen is that, so this particular example event is like, murder happens, which happens 3 other times in this clip. So we thought what might happen is you might get like kind of bumps at the other similar events in the movie. But if you just look at how annotators describe objectively what's going on, not leveraging understanding about the plot or how it fits in with everything else, just like exactly what's happening, like these people are in the room, here's what they're saying, here's like any text that's on the screen, etc. You can come up with a description that is unique to that moment. So it's not necessary that repeated experiences are described in similar ways. The key. So there are kind of two possible ways that the way people recall an event could be kind of broad and not show only like mass on one moment. One is kind of imprecise recalls. So there is a range of kind of fidelities with which people describe an event. So that was that precision thing I showed. So that sometimes plays a role. But if you look on average, the peaks and dips of this kind of mass function actually are meaningful, like conceptually meaningful. So understanding what's happening in this moment requires integrating other things that happen in the movie. It's difficult to think about this as we're watching the episode. Like as you're watching what happens, we kind of automatically bring up like, okay, this moment relates to this other related thing that's happening. But that's really a memory operation that's happening. Also, when you experience this moment, the only thing that's in your head is the stuff that occurred in the past, because we're not psychic, we can't predict the future. So it's only after you've experienced the rest of this show that you understand kind of contextually what's happening here, where you can take both things that happened before and things that happened after, that you can start to kind of really make sense of what was happening. Did you?
This is a semantic model. you wanted, I mean, I also assume that people, when they're listening to stories or watching videos, are integrating information and essentially updating the representations of the events that happen
Sure.
to reflect the relationships between the content.
Yes.
But this model doesn't have any of that in it. It's just the semantic tags.
Well, no, this is a feature vector model, so you can have.
But it's a feature space for the semantics. It's not a feature space of the causal relationships between.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
This person
yes.
killed that person.
That's
like
right.
10
Yes,
years ago.
that's true. Yes.
So most of that information is missing from this model. Actually, this model would work better if that information was included. But then coding that information out from natural stimuli is really hard.
Yeah. True. Yeah. Agreed.
So this is more capturing similar events in the movie where similarity is measured by their semantic projection. So like every time, as you mentioned, every time Watson and Sherlock are joking with each other, then this vector is going to end up, this brain decoded vector is going to end up in the same place in decoded brain space.
Yeah.
Which is fine. It's cool. I like this decoding trick.
There you go.
Yeah, maybe following on from that, I wonder what your thoughts are on how you distinguish between whether what you're accessing is representation or thought, and what you actually mean by representation versus thought. So, if, for example, you were using a similar approach, but you just had different auditory tones, or you maybe had static images, you made those static images either natural or low level, at what point, you could use the same technique, but at what point you would want to describe it as a thought trajectory or a representational trajectory. So I guess what I'm asking is how much is it purely driven by the representation of an external stimulus versus your conscious or non-conscious reaction to that. And what do you mean by, I guess this is a thought question. So, you can have an emotional reaction, a somatic reaction, but I wouldn't think of that as thinking about it. So how do you get at and disentangle any of that?
Okay, there are a ton of questions in there.
Yeah, sorry.
One comment, I guess, is that these.
So are you studying thought is my big question. Or
Well,
are
I
you
think we
studying
are.
representation? And why would you claim it to be thought?
So what I'm calling thought here is a coordinate and word embedding space. I don't know if that's what you think of as a thought or representation, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
So if I was unconscious, you might still be able to decode my brain activity to vocal input, but I wouldn't want to think of that as a thought process.
Yeah, so we can ask about which one of the analyses in this paper is the human annotators. They kind of separated out different features. So like you could say verbal description or like a written description of the people that are on the screen, or what those people are doing action-wise, or is music playing in the background, or is text on the screen, or what's the camera angle. And then you can ask, if you repeat this approach with excluding or including different kind of blends of features, which actually matter in terms of explaining people's behaviors. And if you just look at kind of really low level, kind of meaningless sensory, or meaningless from a narrative perspective, features, they can't kind of capture these sorts of trajectories. Whereas if you, the sequence of frames that kind of flashes by in a movie isn't going to capture these kind of richly structured narratives. It's really kind of the sequence of things that are happening from a high-level description, at least in the way you think about it.
But still inherent to this external stimulus. I guess as distinct from, so for example, in a freshman class, we all just watched Memento, which has a really interesting trajectory because there's a lot of reveals and you piece things together, which perhaps relates to what Jack's saying. So actually the way you process something is very different, even though you go back to the same event later. And so the kind of other sort of things depending on what you mean by thought in a lay sense, might be like, oh God, so what this means is X, or wow, that's really violent. Do I like watching that much blood on my screen? Or So it's not so entirely stimulus-based. So I'm wondering to what extent, like, and maybe this also ties into Frederick's question about, is it just a poor fidelity of that external stimulus, or is it individual differences in your internal dialogue based on that external stimulus?
Yeah. So first of all, for this analysis, what I'm showing here, this is based on behavior.
You're not
so there's
looking at
like
that, yeah.
we already know what people say and how they describe what's happening.
I guess
In terms of fidelity, I mean, the question for me is like, there's one way of thinking about kind of decoding accuracy is saying, if here's what you're remembering, how much kind of posterior mass is placed on my decoding of what's happening, on the event that actually happened. So like the height of the kind of black line in that kind of distribution plot. So that's one way of measuring like how much we're able to accurately capture what you're actually talking about. But the key question that I think both of you are getting at is like, does the do the other parts of that distribution have meaning, or is it just kind of uncertainty that's meaningless? And I think that's what I was trying to kind of get at about the peaks and dips of that distribution actually occur in meaningful places. So it's not simply there's noise, it's that even other semantically related events are not kind of appearing as peaks unless they are kind of thematically or conceptually related to what was happening in that moment. So if you don't need to integrate across different events to understand what's happening, the prediction is they won't appear as peaks in that distribution. Yes?
So you made a contrast there with like Tolfin saying classic theories don't really fit with this sort of idea. And I was thinking they sort of do. I mean, if I think back to all the San Francisco 49er games of the past season or something, right? There's going to be, they're going to correspond to, I think they're going to correspond to all those different peaks, and there's going to be some sort of blending in those memories.
So the way that, even dating back to like the 50s, like kind of drifting context, like SD's drifting context models, the way we typically model episodic memory is using these weighted blends of thought. So from a mathematical standpoint, the existing models are totally consistent with kind of the sorts of ideas that I'm describing, and we use some of these same models that other labs are using. The kind of discrepancy is in how we attach kind of English words to describe what those models are doing. And I think when we are mathematically representing experiences as weighted blends of kind of thoughts from different time points, it doesn't feel to me like you are mentally time traveling back to one specific moment. You're kind of spreading your thoughts over a range of moments. So this is how we model kind of reinstating thoughts in most modern kind of memory models, but that's not how we verbally describe what those models are doing. We say we're bringing back the thoughts we had at one moment, but if our thoughts are spread across many moments, there is no one moment. Yes?
So the problem with using these commercial films, of course, is they're edited for uniqueness, and so since you're interested in really what the brain is doing, you thought, that.
Yeah. So other sorts of kind of data we're playing around with are like natural conversation. So you just like videotape people having a conversation, or you could go out, and we haven't done this, but you could go out into the world and like video people behaving in the real world, and that would be kind of naturalistic in the stricter sense. I'm not trying to claim that a movie is like real life. Real life does not occur in scene cuts and exciting music playing, and like usually it's much more boring than like Sherlock. That's not what I'm using these stimuli for. It's simply to get a stimulus that has meaningful structure at many timescales. I'm not saying that's the same range of timescales that life happens, or even the same content that is in our lives.
It might be interesting to compare this like with experts watching abstract experimental films, where an expert can extract a narrative that a naive person would, or listening to different levels of abstract music, where again, an abstract modern composer would hear the narrative arc that someone else couldn't hear.
That sounds really cool. Or yeah, experts and non-experts. This could even be done with like, we haven't done this experiment either, but with our Khan Academy experiments, you could take like majors and non-majors watching. So it's like if you've already learned about like intro to physics, then we show you a video on intro to physics. Does your trajectory look different than if you were like an art student?
And the other things we were talking about earlier is that most people in the world don't learn by being taught, but learn by just observation. And so, how would that change your models? If formal teaching is a specific trait of our culture, but not of other cultures.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that our kind of optimal AI teacher's approach aren't intended to capture. So yeah, so hands-on training. If you're watching a video, you are not like physically manipulating stuff. So our approach can't capture that sort of learning and isn't intended to. It's not that learning isn't important. I think it's super important, but we have to start somewhere. That is the kind of learning that people use, is where children are actually just watching adults, and they're not hands-on. They're not hands-on, and they don't. There's no child-directed speech. It's all by observing. So I mean, it is something you can capture. Anyway. Sure. Yeah. Well,
particularly if you want to export it to other cultures, or look at how the human brain actually evolved to learn.
That would be cool. I don't know if until we get access to a time machine, we might not be able to study the evolution part, but it's certainly interesting. I think like one way of studying the kind of cross-cultural question is to say, like if you use a model fit to people from one culture, how much can it work on other people? Yeah. So I think it's like a kind of different framing of how specific do these models have to be question. I should just note like another limitation of this approach has to do with the social aspects of learning and teaching. So part of our kind of current educational experience is like a social dynamic of like people learning to interact with each other and with the teacher, and I think those are super important parts of education, and our approach like factors those out. We are solely trying to optimize the downloading information content matrix style into your brain. How fast can we do that? We are not, I think the social aspects of education are super important, but our like automated device obviously can't and isn't intended to capture that. But I think it's important to separate out different aspects of our current education experience, which are often conflated, which are the social and like knowledge gain benefits. Yes, I think you were slightly faster.
Do you think you could see in these state dynamics cases in which people watch an episode, for example, Friends, that they watch over and over again, they can predict what is going to happen, and then they would see a faster dynamic that maybe loops whenever they see the...
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think repeated exposure, like do your trajectories become more stereotyped over time? Do they like fundamentally
Can you see predictions about stuff that you know is going to happen?
Yeah, well, so there's like, one way of studying prediction is to like stop the movie and say what's going to happen next. So eventually you're going to be able to do that well if you watch enough times and your memory systems are operating. But we could also ask, how predictable are your neural patterns? So if we make a like time series prediction model, we could say, given what your brain has done up until now and what's going to happen next in the movie, can we accurately predict what your brain is going to do next? So yeah, I guess both of these approaches I think are interesting.
Yeah, I found your first slide very compelling, where you had the different time scales of thought, where I'm in the Bay Area, but I'm also here.
Yeah.
And then when you go on and do your little decoding, your thought is going at one time scale. Any hope of being able to like disentangle that into multiple trajectories going at different speeds? And
So there's a little bit of a subtlety there. Those trajectories actually do contain structure at every time scale. So because you can ask for one particular point in this trajectory, how similar that blend of thoughts is. Look, you can just look at the distance to all the other thoughts. So, and there's actually like a, it's not fully invertible, but you could say, well, if every point along these trajectories, so this is a 2D projection of these trajectories, but really they are happening in high dimensional spaces. You could say, for every coordinate along this trajectory, that's a feature vector. So you can correlate every pair of time points and get a time point by time point correlation matrix. That will contain structure at every time scale. You can then use, well, there are a variety of methods. One is multidimensional scaling, to go from a distance or similarity matrix back to the set of coordinates. It's not necessarily the identical set of coordinates, but they're kind of the same up to affine transformations. So you can't recover the rotations, reflections, translations, but you can recover the trajectory shape modulo those sorts of transformations. So actually, these trajectories are capturing kind of multi-time scale information. It's just a little bit funny to kind of think about it. But I think the shape of these trajectories is what's interesting. That tells you how, at every time point, how does the content of the episode unfold. And it's the full shape that matters, not just kind of where one point is. Yes?
So all of your thought spaces that we're talking about so far are depending on these word embedding models, which seems to inherently limit sort of the topics of information that you could be using to capture in this approach. You thought about ways to extend that to, well, I was kind of curious about how the math videos would work out, given that that's something that's very hard to describe and get into a word space that could be converted to semantic content, but also things like motor learning and many of the other types of memory and learning that we know about that maybe don't have their sort of core tenets, sort of easily transcribed into this semantic model.
Yeah, so that's a really important point. So that related to the math aspect of what you said, there's a secret kind of parameter in these models. So these models are all trained on large collections of documents. And you can, in the collection of documents you feed into these models is kind of like a parameter. So one way of getting an accurate or kind of high fidelity description of like math thought space is to use a lot of math related documents. And then that's going to have consequences for other types of thoughts that are not as well represented in the collection of documents. Like if you train these models on math documents, it's going to do a poor job of like representing biology concepts and vice versa.
It might also do a poor job of representing the same mathematical concept that I'm not using a mathematician's language to describe.
Well, could be. We found in practice different wordings tend to, different people's descriptions of the same sort of experience or content do tend to be captured well by the, as equivalents by this approach, but you're right that if you use totally non-overlapping language and the model doesn't even contain the sorts of words that a new person will use, then the approach will fail. The other idea you mentioned about motor learning, in the most general sense, this sort of approach isn't incompatible with motor learning, because anything you can represent as a feature vector could be somehow described in this framework, but it's not really well described by word embedding spaces. So as we're thinking about it, our approaches do not really capture motor learning sorts of tasks. So that's important to note. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about your prediction metric, and if you look for individual participants, is that for how well you actually remember this word?
Which prediction?
Or sorry, the precision.
Oh, the precision. Let me go back. Yeah. So it's So, yeah, so there's some nuance here. One is that, so it's the case that the more precisely you tend to, if you tend to recall the events that you remembered more precisely, you also tend to recall more events. So more kind of detail from the movie overall. But there's a little bit of a trickiness to thinking about this stuff because the number of events that you remember is kind of more of an idea that's drawn from kind of classic studies of memory, like proportion of words in a list you study. It doesn't really tell you about, like everyone recalls these videos pretty well. So everyone's remembering like the overall narrative arc. It's not like some people are just like leaving out huge sections of the story. The question is about like how precisely, like how much detail they're kind of getting out. There's another kind of interesting related point to this, which is that not all events are equally important in shaping these trajectories. So you can see that some of these events, if you were to move the event closer to like its neighbors, it would change the shape of this trajectory. Other events don't have that property. So like these orange events in the path from here to here, if you were to like shift them closer or further from their neighbors, the trajectory would kind of have the same shape still. But if you were to change like one of the corners, that would really change like what the trajectory looks like. And I think there's something special about these kind of control point events. They describe when the narrative arc changes sharply. So there's no kind of specific, like, you can't necessarily predict where the story is going, knowing what happened before and what's happening there. So this event is somehow critical for kind of determining what's happening next. Whereas if you look at events that are kind of collinear, you could kind of know that if you have to go from here to here, stuff happens along the way that's going to be along this path. And so there's some notion of these might be kind of treated differently by our memory systems.
Yeah, I just imagine that some people might have like a more abstract, right, kind of version of a story, so you can probably remember the like really core aspects of the story correctly, but they might have less precise like mapping.
Yeah. So we're looking at this sort of idea in the study we just finished running, but you can look at over time. So you like watch a TV episode. The experiment has like a gazillion parts to it, but the important part is you watch a TV episode, you recall the episode right away, and then a week later we have you remember the same thing. And basically what happens is these like intermediate points go away. So you just kind of, you capture the overall shape, but you lose some of the details along the way. So it's like something about kind of defining the shape of the trajectory is important, but how you subsample kind of fades away over time.
Right. Let's thanks Jeremy one more time.